Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Today we're leaving the Bronze Age behind to talk about something much closer to our current day, because today is Labor Day 2024, and we have lots of, let's call them labor disputes in our American history that look a lot like battles when you dig into them. So today we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about what Labor Day is and why we celebrate it. And then we're going to take a look at one of those labor disputes, the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892. So first things first, what is Labor Day and why do we celebrate it? Well, here's the definition from the U.S. Department of Labor. Observed the first Monday in September, Labor Day is an annual celebration of the social and economic achievements of American workers. The holiday is rooted in the late 19th century when labor activists pushed for a federal holiday to recognize the many contributions workers have made to America's strength, prosperity, and well-being. That's what the Department of Labor says. Or you might prefer the unofficial definition most Americans seem to use. Labor Day is the holiday that marks the unofficial end of summer, in pretty much the same way that Memorial Day is the holiday that marks the unofficial beginning of summer. We recognize the two holidays in similar ways, at least here in the South. We get together with family and friends and we go out to the lake or the beach or the park, whichever we happen to have handy, and we drink beer and grill burgers and hot dogs or maybe barbecue chicken or even steaks if we're feeling fancy. Some towns have parades or festivals. A lot of stores have sales to take advantage of the long weekend. And back when we used to go to the movies, the last wave of summer blockbusters would sometimes release on Labor Day weekend. Or if you're around my age, maybe you remember when Labor Day was first made an official day off of school. My first memory of the holiday was sometime around 1980 when my folks cut an article out of the newspaper with the headline, "Labor Day is Holiday," to remind them that I didn't need to go to school that Monday. But none of that gets into what Labor Day is really about, or at least what it's supposed to be about. So let's take a look at that. See, our United States was founded as a nation dedicated to protecting its citizens' freedom. Now we can debate whether that's really true, or whose freedom the founders really had in mind, or any number of other questions that seem obvious to us almost 250 years later. But I've studied that part of our history, and I've read our founding documents, and it seems to me that those guys honestly wanted to create a nation where the rights of the citizens were more important than the rights of the ruler. And one of the rights they definitely had in mind, whether or not they ever put it down on paper, was the right to make money. And in those days, just like today, one of the best ways to make money was to get other people to do the work you wanted done. Of course, when other people are doing your work, it's pretty much inevitable that you're going to disagree about how the work needs to get done. Whether you're talking about the best way to approach the work, or the days and hours folks are willing to work, or the conditions they're willing to work in, or what they're willing to accept in compensation. And that's how you get labor disputes. Now, let's not pretend the good old US of A is the first country in the world to have labor disputes. The earliest one I could find, looking back, was from ancient Egypt. It started in 1159 BCE when workers building a tomb staged a sit-in because their wages came in more than a month late. So almost 3,000 years before anybody thought of the United States of America, labor strikes were already a thing. But I think these kinds of disputes take on a different note when everybody involved has this idea that they're just as good as everybody else involved, that their right to the pursuit of happiness is every bit as valid as their boss's right, especially when their bosses don't act like they think the same way. And I think we also have a tendency to crank everything up as high as we can get it in this country. Hardly a damn one of us is willing to be wrong, and when we disagree on something as fundamental as our livelihood, it's easy to get our backs up where neither side can back down. And when that happens, the risk of violence goes way up, and you get events like the one we're talking about today. Having a national holiday called Labor Day doesn't fix that, But if you want your people to keep believing they're just as good as the people they work for, and you celebrate the people they work for and call them innovators and leaders and captains of industry, well, it makes sense to also talk about the strength and work ethic of the workers. And sometimes when they find the gumption to stand up to their captains of industry, you praise their courage too. So, Labor Day became a federal holiday to be celebrated on the first Monday in September back in 1894. If you like to look at things in the best possible light, the holiday commemorates the workers who helped build one of the most prosperous nations on earth. If you prefer a more cynical approach, well, maybe it was a play by elected officials who needed workers' votes to get elected. Now, the Homestead Strike took place in 1892. So those guys didn't have a national holiday to encourage them. And while Homestead might have helped Congress make the decision, making Labor Day a federal holiday certainly didn't bring an end to violent labor clashes. We've got plenty of those in our history before and after 1894. But we can think of Labor Day as an aspirational holiday. We know we don't always live up to the ideals of the labor movement, and we probably never will. But we mostly don't kill each other over labor issues anymore, and workers today have a boatload more rights than they did back in 1894, so it seems like we can call that progress. So that'll cover Labor Day. What about the Homestead Strike? Isn't that why we're here today? Fair point. Let's get to it then. Just like every time, we need to go over some background. In 1892, John D. Rockefeller was the wealthiest son of a bitch in the world, with a fortune even Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos haven't exceeded when you convert it to today's money. And right behind Rockefeller was Andrew Carnegie, the owner of Carnegie Steel. And one of Carnegie's steel plants was the Homestead plant on the Monongahela River, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, on the Monongahela River near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The steel workers at Homestead were pretty well compensated for their day and more or less satisfied with their work. They worked long shifts, mostly making armor plating, with only a couple of holidays a year. The work was dangerous, and if they got injured or killed, they and their families were pretty much shit out of luck. But as working conditions went in the late 1800s, Homestead wasn't a bad gig. But the economy turned down in 1890, and by 1892 the price of steel had fallen by almost 40%. This led Carnegie to cut wages, and in early June the company announced it would not be renewing its 3-year contract with the union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, when it expired at the end of June. Now, Andrew Carnegie came out of East Nowhere, Scotland, and while he was building his incredible fortune, he built a reputation for himself as a man of the people, making a point of paying good wages and even making noises about supporting his workers' right to join unions. Even today, his philanthropy is the stuff of legend. He built and endowed public libraries across the United States and around the world, and by the time he died in 1919, he may have given away something like $6 billion in today's money. But his behavior in the summer of 1892 doesn't show any particular friendliness toward unions or the guys who worked for him. To start with, he was in Scotland for the whole summer, leaving the company's affairs to his CEO, Henry Clay Frick, who was opposed to unions on principle. And throughout the crisis, he and Frick exchanged telegrams, making it clear that Frick had Carnegie's complete approval for pretty much everything he did. So much for Andrew Carnegie, friend of unions. The ironic part is that only about 750 of almost 4,000 workers at the plant were amalgamated members. But when Frick made it clear that he wasn't going to work with the union, that's when negotiations broke down. The workers rejected Frick's final take-it-or-leave-it offer, and the plant stopped production on June 28, 1892. And the furnaces were allowed to go cold, which I'm told is a pretty big deal in steel production. After that, things pretty much went to shit. So all 3,800 workers voted to strike on June 30th. They set up their pickets all around the plant, and it looked like they were settling in for a long wait. Frick responded by building a fence around the entire plant, complete with watchtowers at the corners and loopholes for rifles to keep the building secure from any shenanigans the workers might decide to get up to. The workers started calling the fenced-in plant Fort Frick and refused to allow any replacement workers or even the local sheriff's office to occupy it. So Fort Frick stood empty and the plant stood cold. So Frick contacted the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Now you might recognize that name if you watched a Western from the 1980s or played the Red Dead Redemption games or apparently BioShock Infinite too. In 1892, the Pinkerton Detective Agency was the largest private law enforcement agency in the world, and a big part of their business was strike breaking. Interestingly, Pinkerton still exists today, although they don't do government law enforcement work anymore. If you could ask Henry Frick what he was trying to do, I'm sure he'd tell you he was just trying to get his plant working again. After all, every day that plant set cold, Carnegie Steel was losing money. I'm sure he'd tell you he'd be happy to take back any workers that wanted to come back at the lower wages he was offering and without the union protection. And if you ask the strike organizers and the workers what they were trying to do, I think they'd probably tell you they just wanted their old jobs back. But maybe Carnegie Steel could keep the union around just in case they needed it down the line. And at the end of the day, spoiler alert, that's more or less what happened, except the union didn't come back. But a lot of people are going to do a lot of wrong before that happened. So, Frick contacted the Pinkertons, who scraped together about 300 random guys from New York and Chicago for about $5 a day per man, literally hiring them off the street, and didn't bother to tell them where they were going. They put them on fortified barges, issued them rifles and uniforms, and sent them up the Monongahela toward Homestead. The plan was for the Pinkertons to get access to Fort Frick and the plant, so Frick could start bringing in non-union replacement workers, or scabs, to get the job done. Now, you know what happens when you lock people out of their workplace, refuse to negotiate with them, and make it clear you're going to replace them just as soon as you can manage it? You know what happens when you do that in a world where there's no such thing as state unemployment, public assistance, or severance packages? Yeah, they start wondering how the hell they're going to keep their kids fed. And that tends to make folks a little nervous. And you know what happens when you hire a bunch of guys off the street and put them on boats, but don't tell them where they're going? And you give them brand new rifles and ammunition and tell them there's nothing to worry about? Yeah, they start wondering if maybe there's something to worry about. And that also tends to make folks a little nervous. And you know what happens when you put those two groups on a collision course, thinking the first group, the ones that are trying to figure out how the hell they're going to feed their kids, is going to back down? Well, if you pick door number 1, the one where shit's about to hit the fan, you got it. No shit, there they were. July 6th, 1892. Not quite a week after the workers voted to strike. The workers have armed themselves with whatever weapons they could scrape together, probably mostly old muzzle-loading rifles, shotguns and revolvers, and maybe a few newer repeating rifles. And every man would have had a knife of some description, and some would have had makeshift clubs or baseball bats, and maybe a few big wrenches or wood axes or pry bars. And apparently quite a few fireworks laying around, presumably leftovers from their 4th of July celebrations. They were by no means a military organization, but as these things go, they were pretty well armed. I found one source that said they had boats out patrolling the Monongahela. Now, nobody's been able to get through the strikers' lines since they set up their pickets on the 30th. And the strikers appear to have been unwilling or unable to break the locks on Fort Frick and occupy the plant itself, so it's sitting cold and unoccupied. Around 3 a.m., some sentries the strikers had watching the river saw the barges coming and started spreading the alarm. Or maybe one of the boats sounded its steam whistle to let folks on shore know they were landing. Whichever it was, the strikers obviously had some kind of alert system in place, because it didn't take long for the strikers at home to grab their weapons and get to the landing that served the plant. When the barges started trying to land around 4 o'clock, the strikers were there to stop them. I couldn't find a good number for how many strikers were there, armed and ready to fight. But if there were 3,800 in total, it seems like they had to have had at least 1,000 guns among them, against 316 Pinkertons on the boats. It seems like the Pinkertons figured they were going to make a strong enough show of force that the strikers wouldn't be willing to shoot back, and they could march right off their boats and up to Fort Frick without having to fight. Hell, it's probably a tactic that worked for them many times in the past. But if that's what they had in mind, that's not how it went down. Which you already figured out, because this is a show about battles, right? Now, an amphibious landing is a tricky operation, even with trained soldiers or Marines landing on an unoccupied beach. If you have World War II Higgins boats, which can run right up on the beach and drop the entire front of the boat, which also doubles as a ramp for the guys to run off, you can get it done with a minimum of confusion. If not, you're trying to offload a high school gym's worth of guys through a door and down a ramp onto the beach. Park a pair of barges next to each other where the guys on the one that's still out in the river have to run across gangplanks to the one that's on shore, then go through the door and down the ramp. Now you've set yourself up for a clusterfuck. And remember, that's with trained soldiers who know how to follow orders, and nobody on shore trying to shoot them as they come off the boats. Pinkertons hit Homestead 50 years too early to have Higgins boats, and they didn't have trained soldiers, and they had guys on shore ready to shoot them, and they were hugely outnumbered. Under those conditions, yeah, that ain't happening. And no surprise, it didn't happen. The strikers fired a few shots at the boats, not hitting anybody, but breaking a couple of windows. And the Pinkertons hesitated on their barges, secure behind their reinforced walls, and tried to figure out what the hell they were going to do next. The Pinkerton commander, a guy named Frederick Hindy, came out on deck and yelled that they were coming ashore and the strikers should get the hell out of the way and let them do their jobs. One of the strikers yelled back a warning that they needed to stay the hell on their boats. Then both sides seemed to have moved at once. Strikers ran forward to grab the bottom end of the gangplank so the Pinkertons couldn't use it. And at the same time, a squad of Pinkertons rushed out into the open section of the deck, getting ready to swarm down onto the beach ahead of the rest of their buddies. Both sides fired, and one Pinkerton and one striker fell dead, and several on both sides went down wounded, including Hindy, shot in the leg and shoulder. In the next couple of minutes, 2 more strikers were killed. The Pinkertons managed to get their wounded and dead back below decks, and the strikers retreated up the bank and started throwing up barricades out of scrap steel. One of the strike leaders, a man named Hugh O'Donnell, realized he had completely lost control of his men at this point, and he started hollering at the non-combatants, the wives and children who were of course there to watch, to get home and out of the line of fire. Meanwhile, the tugboat that had towed the barges in managed to get away with the Pinkertons wounded, but when it tried to come back later that afternoon, the strikers managed to drive it off again. So the Pinkertons were stuck in their barges with no help coming. Now, if either side had been any kind of a military organization, things might have gone differently. Hell, it's likely there were veterans on both sides, especially among the Pinkerton officers, but nobody was in a position to take charge of either side and direct operations in an effective manner. So things pretty much settled into a standoff. Because the thing about military operations is that there are times you can't move forward without taking casualties. That's one of the things military training prepares you for. The guys on the front line understand that at some point, in order for the mission to move forward, in order for their buddies to go home, they might have to be the one who takes a bullet. It's an ugly truth that we don't talk about much, but frontline warfighters understand it in their bones. And if they trust their leaders, when that order comes down, they'll usually do what they have to do. So, if the Pinkertons had had that level of training, if they had assaulted violently up the shoreline, they probably had the firepower with their Winchester repeaters to get through the strikers' barricades and into Fort Frick. And if the strikers had assaulted the boats violently, there's no question they had the numbers to kill the Pinkertons or force them to surrender. But only a few people at Homestead that day had that kind of training. And pretty much nobody trusted their leaders that far. And pretty much nobody on either side had gotten up that morning thinking they might have to kill or die that day. So, nobody assaulted in either direction. Instead, the Pinkertons hunkered down in their barges, while the strikers tried to figure out how to crack them open or sink them. They took pot shots anytime they saw somebody moving, and sometimes they hit somebody. They managed to knock a few holes in the reinforced roof of one of the barges with dynamite, but did no serious damage. They tried dumping oil into the river and lighting it on fire, but no dice. They went and got a 20-pounder cannon from the Civil War from the local Grand Army of the Republic Hall. It was still in working order because they used it on holidays. And tried shooting it at the boats, but they gave that up when a wild shot killed a striker. They tried ramming a raft full of burning material into the barges to set them on fire, but the boat missed and floated harmlessly down the river. Incidentally, that was a pretty common naval tactic during the age of sailing ships. Load up an old or damaged ship with straw or cloth, or soak the planks in oil, maybe add some gunpowder if you have enough to use it that way, light the whole thing on fire and send it toward the enemy fleet. When it worked, it could tear the hell out of the enemy. But this time, it didn't work. They even tried ramming the barges with a rail car full of burning oil, but the tracks ended too far from the landing and the car couldn't get close. So, by about noon, the strikers were out of ideas except to sit on the shore and snipe at any Pinkertons foolish enough to show themselves through the holes in the boats. In the meantime, the Pinkertons had managed to collect everybody in the offshore barge, and the strikers' attacks had knocked enough holes in the boat that some of the Pinkertons were able to do some sniping of their own. 5 more strikers went down, dead or dying, during the course of the day, and 2 more Pinkertons. The Pinkertons even tried waving white flags a few times during the day, but the strikers shot up the flags, and sometimes the poor bastards waving them. And did I mention it was the 6th of July? Yeah, nice and hot. The strikers had a nice breeze off the river, and the wives went around at lunchtime serving sandwiches and lemonade, so they weren't too bad off. Plus, they were steel workers used to working in a hot environment. The guys on the boat didn't have any of that. They were hunkered down inside a metal and wood box with the sun beating down on top of it, and they couldn't even get close to the air holes for fear of getting shot. So by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they were almost out of water, and most of them were pretty much over the whole thing. But the strikers were starting to get bored enough to listen to their leaders, and the leaders were starting to realize they were in an unsustainable situation. Yeah, they had a lot of men and plenty of weapons and ammunition. They had the Pinkertons contained, and the local sheriff had done pretty much nothing but ask them nicely to stop. But eventually, he would get serious, or the state militia would get involved, or Pinkerton would send reinforcements, or more likely all 3. And when that happened, they knew they were fucked. Especially if they went ahead and killed all the Pinkertons like some of the strikers were still saying they should. So by about 5 o'clock, most of the strikers were ready to let the Pinkertons go. And the next time somebody flapped a white handkerchief out of one of the portholes of the boat, O'Donnell went on board to talk to him. And one by one, the Pinkerton men started filing up out of the boat. The strikers confiscated their weapons, made them throw their uniform jackets in the river, then let them down the gangplank to assemble on the shore. Then they looted everything of value left on the boats, doused them in oil, and burned them down to the waterline. When that was done, O'Donnell and a few others started escorting the prisoners up towards the picket lines, and they hoped to safety. But some of the strikers weren't quite ready to let them go. And as the Pinkertons shuffled up the hill toward the gate, the strikers let their rage get the better of them again. It started out with shouting and cussing, and escalated to punching and kicking, which turned to beating with rocks and clubs, and a few strikers started shooting again. And these poor bastards, outnumbered 10 to 1, exhausted, thirsty, some of them wounded and now disarmed, really had not a damn choice but to endure the gauntlet and keep trying to escape. Even some of the strike leaders who stepped in to try to stop the attack went down wounded. These sons of bitches were not fucking around. By the time the survivors made it across the picket lines, 2 more Pinkertons were dead, and just about all of them had been wounded in one way or another. The sheriff and a few volunteers led them to an empty theater where they rested for a few more hours, still without anybody offering them any food or water, until they could be loaded onto rail cars and shipped back to Pittsburgh. So, the strikers held the plant, and they had won the battle, and it had only cost the lives of 9 strikers and 7 Pinkertons, and the total would climb to 35 in the next couple of months as more men succumbed to their wounds. But they had pretty much pissed away any chance they had at improving their situation. The violence burned up most of the sympathy they had earned among the public, and when 8,500 soldiers of the Pennsylvania militia showed up a few days later on the 12th of July, they were able to take control of Fort Frick without a fight. Carnegie brought scabs in, and before long the plant was back in operation. Then, on the 23rd, some chucklehead tried to assassinate Frick in Pittsburgh, and the bottom dropped out of the strikers' cause. They managed to hold on until November, then packed up their pickets and drifted away. The leaders were blacklisted in the industry, but some of the strikers managed to get their old jobs back at about half their original pay. So what the hell did they accomplish? Well, Amalgamated was pretty much done after the strike. The strike leaders were blacklisted and had to start over in new industries. A few of the leaders were arrested, but prosecutors couldn't find juries willing to convict them. And Carnegie reported record profits in 1894. So in the short term, it looks like 35 men died for jack shit. But in the long term, maybe they made a difference. Because we don't have 12-hour workdays anymore, or 7-day work weeks, and we have a minimum wage and safety regulations, and most industries have paid time off, and workers comp for injuries, and companies that are big enough to afford it share the cost of some kind of health insurance for their employees. The Homestead Strike didn't make any of that happen, but every time workers stand up for their rights, it makes an impact. A drip in the ocean, a brick in the wall, a step up the mountain. And you know what we call slow progress? Progress. It's probably too much to hope that we'll live in a Star Trek world one day where the people in charge recognize the inherent value of the people who work for them and vice versa. But as long as people are willing to stand up for themselves, we'll keep inching in that direction. And it seems to me that's a fight worth fighting, just as much as any battle. All right, look what we have today. We have a scorecard today. I just almost left this off for this episode because Homestead was such a clusterfuck, it barely makes sense to rate it. But we're going to do it just to see how it comes out. We don't really even have leaders to rate, so we're going to give the scores to the strikers and the Pinkertons without bothering to name the leaders. Let me just scoot this over so that you can maybe see it a little better. All right. So reminder, each principal is graded on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. I'll add a brief explanation for each grade. First category, mass. This is your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefield. Remember back to the discussion of what might have happened if either side had been a proper military unit. This didn't happen on either side. So both sides get a 1 for this. Offensive. The degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. Once again, didn't happen. Surprise. Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. The Pinkertons tried to do this by coming in by water in the early morning, but the strikers were paying close enough attention that it didn't work. So the strikers get a 1. Pinkertons get a 2 on this one. Security. Keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. The strikers get this one for having scouts out watching the river. The Pinkertons attack completely blind, probably expecting to be able to bull rush their way into the plant, just on the threat of violence. So the strikers on this one get a 3, and the Pinkertons get a 1. Maneuver. This is your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. Piss poor on both sides, which is what you get when you have no leadership, no real plan, and no coordination. Both sides get a 1. Objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. The Pinkertons wanted to occupy Fort Frick so the company could bring scabs in, but I'm not sure anybody but the officers knew that. The strikers wanted to keep the Pinkertons from breaking their lines, and it seems like they all knew that, whether or not their leaders actually communicated anything. So the strikers get a 3, Pinkertons get a 2. Unity of command. Every soldier on the battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. Nope. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. I guess both plans were pretty simple, to the extent anybody had a plan at all. So they both get a 2 on this one. And economy of force. Your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. The Pinkertons threw everything they had directly at the plant, but managed not to leave too many guys exposed when they realized the strikers were going to fight back. The strikers had so many guys they didn't need to endanger more than a few at a time, and the Pinkertons weren't doing much shooting back anyway, but I don't get the sense there was much in the way of control going on. I guess both sides get a point here, if only by accident. So our totals, the strikers get 15 out of 45. And the Pinkertons get 13 out of 45. So the strikers edged this one out, but mostly because they already held the ground and they outnumbered the Pinkertons by more than 10 to 1. And here we see the difference between a glorified riot and a proper battle. When a crowd of people is moving as a mob, it's a whole different animal than when there's a plan and a leader directing its efforts. So that's it for our Labor Day special. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your friends. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Enjoy your Labor Day and have a good one.